Welcome to the CTO2CTO podcast, where Chief Technology Officers dig into the challenges and opportunities that leaders face every day at the intersection of business and innovation. I'm your host, Lucas Hendrich, CTO at Forte Group.
In this episode, I'll be talking with Derek Wise, the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Civica, a global leader in public sector software and technology. We'll discuss the multidisciplinary aspects of the role and how it pairs with his diverse industry and personal experience. Here's the conversation. So Derek, it's great to be talking to you today.
Thank you.
One of the questions I had for you, just looking at your background, is that you've worked in different geographical regions, different cultures. Maybe if you can take us through a little bit of, introduce yourself, as well as what insights have you gained working in different regions of the world, and maybe, what are things that are unique, and what are some things that you find are the same everywhere you go?
Yeah, so I enjoy this part of my career, my CV. If you go look at me, and it says I've done a little bit of everything from video games. I ran my own company for a while that was in infrastructure and hosting and IT, pharmaceutical research, and advertising. So I've been around a little bit, and now I work in government technologies across both healthcare, education, and local government. So it's a pretty wide range of things. The things that are consistent for me have always been solving some of the common problems in software, which is, can I make this simpler? Does it have to be this complex in order to solve the problems? And where is the reusable technology? So one thing that's common across the board is I walked in every company I've ever walked into, I'm like, do you have a single sign-on? And can you start to normalize your user interface so that customers start to have an expected experience with you and your brand? Mm-hmm. These are common regardless of geography, language, cultural differences. It doesn't really matter. There's still some core components to a product. So underneath all the titles and roles I've had, I consider myself the platform guy. I'm almost always trying to figure out how to take what's been built or what needs to be built and turn it into something that's a little bit more reusable, componentized, or service-oriented type architecture for whatever offering I'm trying to build.
So it's interesting because also it's different industries too, right? So one of the things I like to think about, you have maybe the platform mindset or the SaaS mindset, but you go into a tech-enabled services company and you have to kind of build out that platform. Talk a little bit about those challenges, because I think there's a lot in that.
Yeah, so it's not as simple as there's a formula for every company. So you do have to treat everyone like an individual. So it's just like meeting someone for the first time. You've got to establish what's common and what you share and what you don't share. So whenever I'm working with a company about where they are in their product development life cycle and where they want to be, we kind of start with an audit on what tools do you have, where are you at, and also my CEO says this brilliant thing: skill set, mindset, and organizational structure. So you kind of have all three of those components, and mindset's probably the very first one to start with. Is the team in the place where they're really ready to go on whatever journey that we're signing up for? So if you work in a legacy software company that's got truly monolithic single piece of software kind of structures, and that applies to everywhere. I've been in video game companies that had that, right? So even some of the coolest tech is actually fairly monolithic and really hard to break apart. You have to ask, is it worth it? Do you really want to go on this journey? Is service-oriented architecture right for you? And if so, in what quantum and at what speed? Mm-hmm. So you start those conversations early on, and I think that's where everything's the same, but it is very different per company as far as like where you start and where you aspire to finish.
And so where has that been hardest to, let's say, reconcile with a domain? So how, going from gaming to pharmaceuticals, what are the hard parts, or the tails of that where it's most challenging?
The places where it's the easiest is where you don't have a whole lot of legislative frameworks to deal with or governance and restrictions around compliance. So in healthcare, HIPAA in the United States would really have an adverse effect on how fast you could go with something, what you could do with data. Similar to when I was in advertising, GDPR made a big difference about what we could and couldn't do it at what speed with what tools. Where on the other side, advertising and video games was really a lot more about what the customer could consume and what it was appropriate for us to do with them. So a smaller distance between us and the customer. And I think that's where you can really figure out the velocity of change that you can do, is the distance between you and your product and your customer.
Interesting.
It determines that. So what is it, Kevin Bacon and
Yeah, 6 degrees.
six
Yeah.
degrees of separation. Like, how many degrees of separation between your product and your customers are there legislative compliance or regulatory things that would restrict your ability to make change?
So gaming would be ideal in that sense.
Absolutely. We made lots of bad changes. I've changed something, but we could fix it in 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Where in a healthcare or pharmaceutical research space, anything that you made a change on could have a 10-year knock-on impact to the discovery of a drug. So you had to think really hard about making those changes. So a lot more thought went into the pre-planning process, where frankly, when we're looking at the funnel for acquiring a new customer in a free-to-play video game, we could just change the fields around and see if it made a difference in the funnel. And if it didn't, we switched back.
So you're answering, in a sense, one of the questions I had thought about prior to this conversation, which is, what are aspects of being a CTO at a gaming company that might be surprising to our audience? People might think that gaming companies, you're a gamer, it's your passion, and then you get a bunch of gamers together, you build games for gamers, and It's easy peasy, right? But I'm sure it's not that simple.
Yeah, I think if you look at where some of the biggest innovations have happened over time in technology since the 80s, video games has led the way in quite a few things. So when you think about structures around A/B testing on workflows for web development, we're looking at free-to-play games and funnels and the drop-off, and we're trying to figure out, do I need to get them to validate the email? Because that might have another 12% drop-off in acquisition. So it's a great place to go experiment if you want that high fidelity. So it is not fun and games, so to speak. It's a lot of standard process that you'd use in any web-based application for client acquisition, and it applies everywhere. You just have a little bit more latitude with your attire. Jeans and t-shirt are totally fine, and also a little bit more risque when it comes to the type of changes you can make with your customer base.
Mm-hmm.
So I think video games, being a CTO in video games, is the exact same job as being a CTO at a large enterprise software company, just with different things you can change at different speeds. So it's fundamentally the same job. So for me, I think one of the things that I find interesting is when people see that I've been in video games, they assume that that's a different quality of software development practice and a different kind of practitioner.
Well, it's a different toolkit to a certain degree.
Yeah, there are some different tools to it, but the fundamentals are still the same. The exact same thing that I've done in large software companies happens in small video game companies. Is there a single sign-on? Can we reuse some of this tech? Wait, why did we build this monolith over here that is no longer maintainable? It's the exact same problems exist. It's still people writing code.
Yeah.
And so those fundamental skills are still required, and you can still transfer them there. You just have to be a little bit more careful about how rapid some of the changes are in some environments, enterprise software with governance, risk, and compliance, versus in a video game company that's really just looking at the marketing inbound funnel of customers. Is very different metrics you track against.
Yeah, something you said when you think of Slack, that was born of video game development as well.
Exactly, yeah. And Slack is just a derivative of IRC, right? Like, so if you notice, you just see that they kind of changed it and packaged it in a way that's, we'll make this easy for people to install.
Yeah.
Free for them to install. Try it before you buy it, and then put the hooks and triggers in there. So they basically take a game design document around how to link and get people into a thing, and built it into the SaaS model for Slack.
Yeah,
it's brilliant.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Talking about legacy monolith applications, I think I had a question for you that was a kind of one of those. There's no right answer questions, but just your thought process. At Civica right now, I understand it's a portfolio of products.
Yeah.
So what would be more challenging, and why, or just, maybe the different challenges, taking one big monolith and breaking it apart, decoupling it, making it modern, or taking several modern platforms and integrating them when they're both sort of born of different tech stacks
so
talent.
So they got their own challenges, right? So both of them are difficult for different reasons. A lot of what I see that's hard to change does have to do a little bit with the architecture, but also part of the success of the product. So a really successful, highly valuable, highly profitable monolith is hard to change.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you start to tinker with it, it does mess with all the customers and all the revenue base. Because it's not fragmented, it's not segmentable. So although you might want to make a change, it can be very expensive to change and also risky to change. So I see monoliths that are highly successful as very hard to change. Monoliths that have a small customer base on them or are declining in their value, they're easier to change because, again, the business desire to make a change is higher, where the risk might be lower because we're turning customers already on our legacy tool. Great. There's a great imperative to go out and make a change. We've got 100% year-over-year growth on our legacy tool. It's very hard to convince the business that now is the time to rewrite that tool when they're seeing success. So I think success breeds, like, honestly, the biggest risk in making change. If I had to choose between the two, though, highly segmented modern products, I can put a REST API around them and connect them together. It's just an easier way to work modularly back into a platform than to try and crack the monolith. And typically when you say crack the monolith, what I've experienced in my career is everyone knows them as different things, stored procedure calls or triggers, where someone wrote a really smart script into the database with no documentation, no linkage, and you have no idea what it does. It is unpicking the spaghetti code that is the danger in legacy systems, where you don't know what happens if you remove that thing. And I've had it happen in large enterprise. I've also had it happen in video games. I worked for, and I can say this one out loud, CCP Games in Iceland. They wrote everything in Python, 16-bit Python, single-threaded application, everything in one space, one live universal video game that everyone played simultaneously from one hub. It's brilliant. Absolutely love it. Until you try to change something.
Yeah.
You don't understand if you move this line of Python, what it does to the whole system. And it's very hard to unpick.
So there's two thoughts that I want to reflect on. One is just on what you just said. I think the world would be surprised. I say the world at large, maybe the non-tech business community would be surprised at just how boring and old a lot of technology is that we have to deal with, that may be wildly successful. And that's why you don't go and change and modernize it. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so it's rare to walk into a group and I don't know, I haven't been hired yet at least, to walk in and take a look at a piece of software that is already in microservices or nano service architecture, using service-oriented architectures, already has Swagger, automatic documented endpoints, and a CI/CD pipeline that publishes every hour. It's rare that you find those, and that's where you're getting hired to come in and do work. Those are usually generated from your legacy system.
Right.
You decided to make a move from because you've met the scale problem. And even some of the most innovative companies that I've met, they started somewhere and they're trying to unpick the MongoDB choice they made years ago, or they're trying to unpick the Redis pipeline they built and put it on Kafka or something. They're making these choices now because they learned from it. And I think we need to be careful as a tech leadership industry to not self-flagellate here and be really critical of ourselves, that we have made a choice that got us through that first part of that journey of that piece of software, and now we can make choices that let it grow to the next stage. But yeah, I haven't found anywhere yet that isn't carrying some legacy tech or some legacy choice that at the time might have been right, but at scale or now or in this world with a new security issue is the wrong choice for the business.
Yeah, and I think it's a huge risk too that a lot of those choices are rarely documented. And it's so easy to go back and say, oh, this is what a horrible decision.
Right.
I know I've done that, and then come to find that it was a decision I made or code that I wrote that you just look at it 6 months later and you think, who would have done that?
Yeah, and no matter how hard you try as a software leader, you end up going, wow, when I leave this company, are they going to think that I was, just like I spoke about the last person before me, right? So it's very hard to do, but I do think write it down is a very good policy to have. Why did you make this decision? It's okay if you make a mistake, but the decision was made for these reasons. Here's the scope that's changed. Here's the reason that's changed. Now change the outcome. That's totally fine. But I do think we're often pretty critical of ourselves and our predecessors. I try to be a little gentler on the people that came before me because they usually got the product to a place where I couldn't. So I try to be pretty respectful of those people that are behind. I think maybe we could create a Slack chat group where we all hang out and just praise each other for doing a better job than we give ourselves credit for. But yeah, where we are in companies that I've been at are a bit on the backs of people making really hard choices with really tight budgets to go get a thing done.
Absolutely.
And then they bring me in to go, hey, can you make it scale now?
Yeah.
And that's usually a different set of choices than what they were presented with at the beginning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's very Bayesian in that regard. It's constant.
Yeah, and it's hard to know all the outcomes. It's lovely if you build an architecture for success, but if you got to wait 24 months to deliver that architecture and the revenue opportunity is 2 months away, did you miss it by making better choices, or was the better choice to go ahead and deliver for the customers earlier? And I'm a very big fan of iterative software development, and that means you have to be comfortable with failure in order to do that.
So that's a very, it's pragmatic, but also very empathetic view. Did that come from being a gaming CTO?
I wouldn't say that my pragmatic view came from games specifically.
But just this ability to fail fast and iterate. And
it's where I've probably seen it happen the most, where my favorite story, and I tell this to my teams when I'm trying to get them comfortable that I'm going to create an environment that they're allowed to fail in, is I talk about my failures. And one of the video game companies I worked at, I took all the servers down for 32 hours, my first 30 days in the job. And so it was a very critical moment, and I came back in, the CEO had my face on a screen in front of a burning building in front of 600 employees and said, "Derek, what did you learn from that?" I'm like, never trust the DBA when he said he did the backup. And it was a big joke and it was funny, but they loved that. This team that I worked with, they enjoyed failure, presenting it very loudly about what our failure was. And then from there, I was on a mission. We got rid of all tape backups of the company. We did disk-to-disk recovery. We moved to fiber channel SAN storage instead of some of the legacy systems we were using. And we changed the business and the way that we operated because of a failure, where without that failure, we never would have done it. We would have stayed on DLT4 tape drives and incremental storage in some guy named Ollie's garage here in London, where we were storing those tapes. And that's why it took us 32 hours to recover. Versus now it's just a separate SAN system that we swap the drives on.
Yeah.
And so now we had red, blue, on, off backups real time. And we were the leading how that worked there. But it took a failure.
Yeah, it reminds me of what I think Anthony Hopkins' character in Westworld says, that the best invention of the universe is the mistake.
Absolutely.
So talking a bit about your background, I understand you were in the military at one point. I'm always fascinated at how, so first, being a CTO or a Chief Product Technology Officer, I find it really hard to narrow that down to one skill set or one, it's so multidisciplinary.
Yeah.
I mean, to be successful, you have to be, you have to think business, you have to be, kind of an economist when it comes to budget, when it comes to understanding macro factors, and obviously you have to have a technical background, but that technical background, usually there's something you're deep in that can't span every domain. Right. There's just not enough time. And thank God now we have, Gen AI to help us extend that. So I'm kind of curious though, like what heuristics maybe do you bring to the role that come from, and maybe there's none, but but that come from being in the military?
So for me personally, I definitely get something out of my time in the military. So if I take a step back to your question, my first comment would be, there's no such thing as a CTO. Because I meet CTOs.
Very, very daring, bold statement on the CTO2CTO podcast.
There are a number of CTOs that are fit for purpose for a type of role. So often whenever someone sends me a job advertisement, I'm like, are you looking for a lead developer, come CTO? Are you looking for an engineering manager, come CTO? Are you looking for the agile coach, come CTO? There's a lot of different flavors of that. And some people have a lot of those mixed in. But a small startup in London trying to do a quick thing, quite often looking for a CTO that can also develop code, and they're the #1 committer in the GitHub. Yeah, right. So things like that. Versus what I do today is predominantly building culture. I spend a lot of time right now making sure that my team feels safe to go fail, and focused highly on making sure that I'm hiring people that are better than me. Mm-hmm. So there's no one in my senior leadership team that I am better at their job than them. That's like one of my prerequisites. So they're all better CTOs than me. They're all better engineering managers than me. They're all better VPs of product than me, et cetera. So that's part of what I do. So that's part of what I learned in the Marine Corps was there's a difference between leadership and management. Mm-hmm. And in management's a job title. So I've got a job title as Chief Product and Technology Officer. It's wild and wide, and it covers a lot of stuff. My task though is to be a leader and go, how do I enable these people to be successful? So that's what I primarily spend my time on. So a good CTO, the heuristics I learned were a little bit from the Marine Corps and Navy SEALs War College theory around good leadership traits, which is, if you try to be everything, if you try to do all the work, you're the manager and the leader, and you do all the actions, you're just setting yourself up for failure. Some stories from Good to Great that are in there about becoming that person that's indispensable. Indispensable also means single point of failure. It also means limiter for the business. So try to get out of your own way by enabling your team is the #1 thing I learned in the Marine Corps probably. Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to the earlier question. So say you have 5 product teams. modern platforms, they're all elites.
Cool.
They're deploying, I don't know, 8 times a day in production or more.
Wow. Okay. Great.
Yeah. What are the challenges to integrating those teams? Now you've acquired them into, you're creating an ecosystem. It should be as easy as just exposing APIs, right? But nothing's ever that easy.
So two areas I'd start off. So integrating an API, and the way it works is it's sometimes called a contract, and it really does take negotiation on both sides. Well, who's going to run the interface? Who's going to aggregate this data? Who's going to do the microservice that connects these two things? So there's some work that needs to be agreed on. So while it sounds simple, like there's an API, why don't you just call it and use it? There's typically some other microservice that needs to be done in order to aggregate the data, report it, and who's going to present it and why. So there's work to be done. So agreeing who's going to do what work for what purpose, I think is really important. And one of the reasons why I love my job, which is CPTO, add that product piece to it, is because I think it connects you to the customer and why you're doing it. So instead of the engineering teams independently going, I think I should run this piece of software, we really talk about where it's going to be presented to the customer, how it generates value, and therefore who needs to operate and maintain this thing, where's the closest to the customer. So I use that distance from the customer thing almost every day. So I'm trying to reduce the number of nodes between my product and my customer all day long, including where engineering sets and how far away they are from the customer.
That's a great mental model, and I wonder if that's just kind of something that we're learning over time in technology from sort of burning platform type failures, where there's this thinking, no, we'll just do it this way, and really not being in touch with what the customers want.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we get too purist in engineering, and we're like the hamburger model, the service-oriented architecture is blah, 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 microservice, nanoservices. Yes, that's a means to an end, but if you don't know why you're doing it, you can really go and pontificate all day long about what the right engineering model is, but the outcome to the customer is all that actually matters in the end. I'm a big fan of Phil Knight, like do the right thing for your customer and the money will come. That's kind of how we model this. I like to model at least with my teams. So there's this, I like to think in Neo4j graphs if I can, right? Like I'm looking at all the nodes that are connected to my customer and how far away is my engineering team and my product team from them, and how close could I get them? Can I get my engineering team, my product team to understand and empathize what's going on with our customer? Better things come out of that team.
Do you have meetings with sales to do that? Does that help?
Yeah, well, we use the sales teams as like they're a great stakeholder group. So I like to put the sales and commercial teams in the right place. They are a good aggregator of representing what my customers are willing to commercially commit to. They may not always understand the business imperative that customer is going through. So we try to connect the dots where there might be disconnected. Yes, we want to sell this thing to them. Yes, they're willing to buy it. Does that really tell us why they're doing and what their strategy is? So sometimes that's where I think product managers have a really key value place to play. So I try to connect the product manager there, but then the distance between product manager and engineering team needs to be almost exactly zero. Right. Either embedded in the engineering team in like what I consider the most modern way, or in the worst case, just one node away where they sit outside the product engineering team.
Yeah, it's almost I think this inverse proportionality we're going to see over time, where product thinking and being able to be successful in a product role, and technology being more commoditized and easier to generate, is almost taking it's indexing more on the product side of than the technology side.
Yeah, and I think that's where I think we've grown up over the years, where Scrum and Agile comes out and we talk about doing this way. It's fine, it's great, but it almost got too rigorous for a minute. It felt like Prince 2 project management too.
Right.
So we once we start to really hone in on how to use Agile the right way for customers, it goes back to some of the original paradigms, like can you iterate quickly? Can you get something out the door? When can you show the customer value? How quickly can you get the feedback on the value created? And what I've seen some companies create, and even some that I worked at over time, was giant groups that sat in between the customer and the engineering team.
Yeah.
And that was just too much. So my paradigm is how few people are sitting between the voice of the customer and the engineering team. And that should be just one at max is what I'd like it to be.
That's a great model. And I like the analogy with looking at this like nodes. It's a great way to think about it.
Computer geeks, that's what we do.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So this is the question that you probably saw coming. I didn't prepare this one for you before, but how is AI, and I hate saying AI in a generic sense, but there's lots of different use cases and uses, but specifically, Gen AI, how's that being sprinkled throughout any products you're working on right now. And I'm asking the question really in terms of what material gains are you seeing? And it could either be on the product side and or just in terms of internal development. You mentioned you have to, maybe you have to look at a legacy platform that's got a lot of undocumented stored procedures. And so are you throwing that into an LLM and having it try to sort it out? Like what kinds of things are you trying, experimenting, and learning from?
So start with the things I think are the most concrete. If I could pick a thing to solve for all engineers worldwide, it would be tech debt.
Mm-hmm.
So I see AI as one of those tools that we can use to really unpick how big the tech debt is and how to solve it. If you think about it at its core, it's just a really good translator. So you give it a language and it can convert that to a different language. So going out, look at some of our legacy languages and coming up with recommendations on how to rebuild them. And I've also been working with a couple of companies I can't name, a couple here in London specifically, that can log into our GitHub, go into Dependabot, bounce across all the repos that are affected by a change that we're making and make recommendations, not just to the line of code to optimize it, but recommendations to how to orchestrate all the other pieces that it has dependency mapping to help optimize or rewrite code. That's where I think we're going. And if you've ever written code for a while and you're carrying around a lot of tech debt, it just really slows you down. It makes it really hard to change. So I think if I could unburden software developers in tech debt, the things that we could create would be amazing. So that's where I want to see AI take away some of the drudgery of technical debt and defect fixing. And I've seen great companies do this. So something I can't talk about, like GitHub has some auto fix features now. If there's a legacy security fix that's already been fixed in other places, you find it and click on it, right click fix.
Yeah.
And it'll go apply what it's learned from other places, give you a really big lift. And for my team, we're seeing across the daily active users that are using GitHub Copilot, for example, we're seeing just about 30% of all of the recommendations from Copilot being accepted by our engineers. So that kind of shows you we're starting to really interact with recommendations from Copilot type tools and integrate those into our workflow. And then as an engineer that was in the 90s, so where I got my start, that was me going on SourceForge and copying someone else's code.
Right.
So we've always done this,
Yeah.
right? But instead we've been popping out into other browsers and the search engines to find snippets. Here we're just getting that integrated now into our workflow. It's just reducing the latency.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think when people think about the productivity gains, they often think, oh, it's just writing code for you. And really, it's just about that context switching in which, keeping track of browser tabs that you don't have to
100%.
do anymore.
And that
I
was
love Cursor for that reason, for example.
Yeah, you have to do all this stuff where I'm tracking, here's where I always go for these tools, or here's the guy that I like to track for this snippet. That was how I used to write code. And now it's all that's been read and kind of aggregated in one place. And so when I type in, I'm looking for a quick way to build a clock for the day that works in 24 hours, it can give me examples of things that just work.
Yeah.
And then I can tune and improve from there based on what my application is. Again, another reason why I think engineers need to be really close to the customer so they understand which recommendations to take and build off of.
Yeah, I think about it like I'm learning chess online, right? So you have the chess database and it tells you every move. Well, that's a 97% move, so you know that that's pretty safe, or it's 3%, so you're either an incredible genius, Magnus Carlsen,
Right.
or you're just mucking it up, right?
Yeah.
And I almost feel the same way about any code that's suggested. It's not necessarily the best code or even the right code, but it's within that area, so it gives you a landing zone, something that is just a big gain on productivity.
Yeah. I would just say we're in the early days though, because I'm still seeing really good recommendations sometimes and really bad ones at other times too. So you've still got to have that human in the middle going, that doesn't work, or that does work for my needs. But again, you could just look at the acceptance rates, and this isn't just our numbers. You can look at OpenStats that GitHub Copilot, we're seeing 30% of the recommendations be accepted by engineers and implemented in the code. So if you trust your engineers, that's a pretty good metric for how much efficiency is saving them.
You see that ticking up over time?
No, I think we've gotten to the place where we think the current evolution of that is today.
Right. Yeah.
A new version comes out, a new set of skills come out for it, a new language being supported for it, etc. That those numbers will go up. But if I've got some stuff in Fortran, there's not a translator for recommendations for code snippets in Fortran, so I can't use that there. But in C#, yeah, all day long.
Yep. One of the topics that is becoming more prevalent in conversation, I think, with technology leaders is that working in an investor-backed company, whether it's seed or VC or private equity, and particularly private equity, at least in my experience, one of the challenges for the role is that you are you have to communicate in a very concise way your technology vision and what that means to investors. Yeah. I think that's a unique skill. I'm curious what you think about that and kind of how you handle the pressure of that, especially since it's, you know, not gaming company anymore.
Yeah. It's funny.
Not to say gaming companies don't have investors, but
no.
It's a different kind of.
So I worked at a gaming company that was owned by a private equity company.
Right.
And so and now I work in a government technologies company that works with a private equity company. The paradigms are still pretty much the same when it comes to what are we doing with the funding that we have that makes an impact on the customer and their customers, sometimes more B2B, and how does that help the company generate value? So we still care about that. And it doesn't matter if you're VC or private equity, they have different time horizons.
But I think in private equity, there's more of a chance that the investors are less technologically savvy. It's a dangerous statement, but I feel like, you know, depending on the VC fund, there might be, you know, plenty of tech savvy folks there already. So I'm curious, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I've seen that as being a real challenge. How do you really break that down in a way that a totally non-tech person can say, okay, what's the value?
You definitely have to translate on the board and in meetings to make sure things are there. But again, I'll go back to my original statement where whether I was in a VC-backed company in Silicon Valley, which I was for quite a bit, the language that I used there was pretty much the same that I'm using in private equity now, where we're just trying to simplify it down to the impact it's going to have on the business, the outcomes, and the commerciality of it a lot of times. When I walk into a room, regardless of how savvy the individual may or may not be in REST APIs, it really isn't for the whole room at that point. It's for me and the one other person that understands me, because there's always a CFO in the room. Right? There's always a CRO in the room. And those people, kind of regardless of what company they're at, are not going to be speaking at the level that we would be as a CTO. So I try to make sure that a paradigm that I use is when you're speaking to someone, them not understanding is your fault, not theirs. So I take that as an impetus on me to figure out how do I communicate to my audience what I need them to know. And if my audience can speak Jason, fine, we're talking to Jason. And I've actually had that happen. I got a funny story that maybe I'll tell you another time about a very prominent multi-billionaire CEO that likes to speak in Jason to me. And that's the language that we spoke. But most of the time it's
very efficient.
Very efficient. Actually really annoying, but because he was in, you know, I'm trying to do a PowerPoint presentation for a budget, and he's like, hey, can you open up the editor? I want to change that currency value. That's really a weird place to be at with a CEO, where for the most part, I'm already translating to the language that matters to the team in the room, and not trying to dumb it down, not trying to get anything over on anyone. I think that's the distance. You don't want to sound like you're hiding or obscuring information. But understanding that trying to ramp everyone up to your vocabulary when you don't know their vocabulary is probably not the right way to work it.
Yeah.
So my focus is I'm the communicator. They want to be communicated to. I need to understand their language, not just mine.
So that's not typically an engineering skill one learns in, you know, undergrad degree in computer science, right? So what advice do you have for others? And I think it's a testament to your success, you know, that you're able to communicate that to, you know, an investment, you know, audience that isn't technologically savvy. So what kind of advice do you have?
So it's going to sound a little rough if you're a CTO there, and before you go out and learn Rust, learn English. And the reason why I say that is it's really, really critical that you speak the language that the people that you need to generate alignment with speak. So you knowing another language, another tool set might not be the thing that scales you up and allows you to make a bigger impact on the business. I spend a lot of time and effort trying to learn how the private equity cycle works and how investors think and why this 4 and 5 years is such a big deal and what happens at 6 and what happens at 3. And so I try to educate myself so that I can speak to those individuals in language that matters to them. And also the other advice I'd have is say you don't know. It's my biggest skill, I think, is I'm very happy to walk into a private equity investor and say, I don't really know the answer to that. Could you explain to me what you're looking for? And let them speak. Ask a question and let them answer. And and hear them and understand what their real concerns are and see if you can't solve.
Yeah, people are more forgiving than you might think.
Yeah, people are more forgiving than you think. I think these are highly successful individuals in lots of places. That's totally fine, but they're still human. And if you ask for help, quite often, especially if you're the one that's going to be helping them make more money and helping them make the company better, they want you to be successful. So ask for help it's a really hard thing for us CTO introverts that don't really like interacting with people sometimes can do, is go ask for help from someone outside of your typical circle of techies.
Yeah, and financial engineering is another kind of engineering with a different lexicon.
I spend a lot more of my time with Martin, our CFO, than you might expect, because I need to understand his language and he's catching me up.
Yep. This is one of my favorite questions, and it's also on that in the vein of not necessarily surprise me. Last book, movie, anything that impacted your way of thinking. And I love hearing things that have nothing to do with the typical set of, lean agile books or O'Reilly books. Not that they're bad, but I'm looking for.
Yeah. I think it's the right thing though. So last book that I read and really heavily recommended. I've read some other stuff, but I'm staying off the sci-fi track for a minute. Why We Sleep, last book that I read. I am finding out that 4.5 hours.
Is that a Huberman book?
I think it is.
Yeah. Huberman.
Fantastic research study around how sleep scientifically impacts our daily lives. And I've been one of those people that, 40 different units of caffeine a day, 4.5 hours of sleep, stay up all night, get up early in the morning, crush. And recently I've gotten in the habit of, how do I really get better at being me, and where are my neurons firing the best, and how can I be the most creative? And also being empathetic with others. It's really hard when you're tired and broken, angry, and caffeine deprived, or going through wishing you had more caffeine. I find that this book was really helpful for me, and I passed it around to my leadership team to make sure that they understood that I cared about their own health, and are they taking care of themselves? And also it helps me just be present and better in the room, and less angry or reactive to a situation. I can kind of slow down, think about it a little bit more before I overreact or react or overreact.
So the book you're talking about is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker.
Absolutely, yes.
Correct. Well, then I'll have to read that. I've heard a podcast about it. Now I'm going to go back and check it out.
Podcasts are great, but I'd recommend the book too.
It's a good shortcut.
Yeah, good shortcut. But I think the book is great, and I literally read it on a sun lounger on holiday with my wife in one sitting, and realized I need to change my evil ways. And so it's transformative for me, being prepared for the daily duties that I have to go through. And then I've used it as a catalyst for reminding my team that I care about them too. So I really have pushed it out to my teams.
That's a great insight, and I think it's the way that I think about how we are as human beings, and how these biological processes, they just get in the way of everything, and they make communication messy. They make it hard to get through the day in a consistent way. One of the things that changed the way I think is thinking fast and slow.
Yeah.
And there's an anecdote in there where it's a study actually that about people convicting more criminals right before lunch. Because you can't resist the biological impulse, the hangriness that you get to modify your behavior. So
and that's the last way you want to be making decisions, is because you're angry or out of place.
Or anything, or sleep deprived. Is part of that because you've worked in many different time zones too, do you think? Or
I think I'm just a product of the 90s, I guess is probably the right way to think about it, where I thought that the best way to be the hacker was up all night, working my butt off. Every moment that I took a break was me undermining my product, my productivity, my goal, whatever. And what I've realized is a lot of that time and energy that I threw at a problem was pretty fruitless and actually error prone. And where I find my best productivity is 10:30 to around 12:30. I am the most efficient human I can be, especially when I'm well rested and I know how I can handle the stress that's coming at me. And I'm a better manager for it too. I think my teams can work with me better rather than the stressed out version of me.
Yeah, it's interesting. Speaking of growing up in the 90s in tech, I think we're the same cohort, give or take. What are some thoughts on managing younger talent?
A piece of feedback that I got once from a gentleman by the name of John Chambers, chairman of Cisco Systems at the time. He's like, Derek, no one else is you. And I think that's one of the things I take in the room. I work the way that I work, the hours that I work, the structure that I work in, because that's what works for me. Some of the younger generations that I've met, they're not lazy. They work differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so you got to find different incentive mechanisms, because it's not all about salary. Some of it's about just autonomy. And so I spend a lot of time seeing how autonomous I can support my teams to be. How many of these decisions can you make on your own? How much experimentation can you do? How wide can I make your budget window so that you can just kind of go off and participate? And we just come up with mechanisms for them to demonstrate success, failure, and improvement, versus the rigor that I might have had in the past with a group where I'm micromanaging, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
So I found that some of the younger generations that I'm working with just reject that micromanagement even more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm changing my style to adapt. So good managers, in my opinion, don't have one management style.
Yeah.
So good managers can adapt style to meet their team. So my younger generations, the number starts with a 2 instead of a 1 in their birth year. It's really critical that I am giving them the support they need, but also just the room to go experiment and participate. And even some of the people from older generations that are seeing that and wanting more of that too, I think. So
that's interesting. And I totally agree. And I think one thing that I notice, particularly with that cohort, and now I even with my own kids who are adolescent, is that, they're less likely to demonstrate their dissatisfaction. They're more likely to just tune you out.
Yeah. You just get ghosted, right? So
exactly.
whether they're on the job ghosting you or they've already left the job, you just don't know about it. You don't always get that feedback loop of an escalation to the manager saying this isn't working for me in a one-to-one session. It's just not. They've checked out. Yeah. So you have to be more proactive, I think, in checking in to make sure they haven't checked out.
Yeah. Derek, it's been wonderful talking to you.
Great job.
Really, really appreciate you having being on as a guest. And it's really great insight. Thank you.
Thanks.
This was it for this episode. Join us next time for more real-world conversations between technology leaders. And if you like what you heard, subscribe to CTO2CTO. See you soon.